What's up, everyone? Welcome back to the channel. I am Tyler Brook. Today, technically a Packers rookie preview, different little bit of a twist. Going over Kenneth Odumegwu, NFL International Pathway Program player, that's a tongue twister, out of Nigeria, joined by Justis Mosqueda, my editor, podcast co-host with Acme Packing Company, to talk about who is this kid, why do we know so little about him, what is the NFL IPP program. A very interesting conversation. Why don't we go ahead and give you a little bit of a background on Odumegwu, how this all started, and then go into our interview with Justis. So again, Kenneth Odumegwu, you can see number 68 here in the picture. Born in Nigeria, was a soccer player growing up, and then became a basketball player trying to go through those programs to become a professional. Where Osin Yura discovered him, got him to switch over to football. He played in the NFL Africa touchdown camp where he was named defensive MVP, got an invite to the London Combine. He's actually Green Bay's first IPP allocation. They're getting their first international player. All 32 teams have now had an international player thanks to this. He is training with the edges, so Rashawn Gary, Preston Smith, Lucas Van Ness, all of these guys, a really good group to learn from. Why don't we go ahead and learn a bit more about him and the program thanks to Justis. All right, if you followed any of my work in the past few years, you know I've worked quite extensively with this guy right here, Justis Mosqueda, corporate overlord of Acme Packing Company. Justis, thanks so much for coming on the show. It feels a bit overdue, right, with how much we've talked, especially during draft season?
Yeah, I was wondering when I was going to get the tap on the shoulder, but whenever you need me, I'm here.
Yeah, we'll have Justis on later this offseason to talk about the future of what the defense is going to look like. Yes, Joe Barry is still the defensive coordinator, unfortunately. But I wanted to bring him on today because of, I'm going to get the name wrong, Kenneth Odumegwu. Did I get it?
It's exactly how it looks. So it's different than the Northwestern pass rusher that I struggled with for 3 months last year.
Tomiwa Adibare. I'll never have to know that. Oh, I guess he's in Indy now. I actually will. That information will be useful going forward. But yeah, it's a very interesting player because there's just so many different facets to it. He's from Nigeria. He's part of the International Pathway Program. And it's something that, we've never really bothered to learn much about. But Justis actually talked with one of the guys in that part of the NFL office. So I wanted to bring him on. First off, Justis, can you just tell us a little bit more about who the heck this guy is and how they found him?
Yeah. So Kenneth was a soccer player in Nigeria who I believe at the request of his father transitioned to basketball. The NBA is doing a lot of stuff right now in Africa specifically where they're building these, academies or helping fund them or subsidize them, however you see it, to try to get, international talent built up there because we already see, in China, for example, right? Like the NBA is massive. Everyone's already an NBA fan. In Europe, we're seeing, these large soccer clubs, right? Already have, developmental programs for these basketball guys. And that's where, we're getting a ton of talent. So to spread worldwide outreach, the NBA is building up these academies. And now the NFL is seeing an opportunity specifically with the work that Osin Yura, the former Giants pass rusher. He's basically down there in Africa. He's from, I believe, his family is from Nigeria. Yeah. And then, they moved to England. So he has a lot of ties there. So his relationship, he's a very important person.
Yeah. That's a massive player from the last couple decades.
Right.
Multiple time All-Pro. Am I right?
At least Super Bowl champion, at least.
Yeah.
But his work is basically to not necessarily recruit, but just like be present there. And, if some of these guys are, so like for Kenneth, for example, right? Like he's 260 pounds, 6'6", at least, closer to 6'6" than 6'5" from what I've heard. Just crazy wingspan, crazy arm length, all that stuff. But he's like a little small to be, a power forward for the NBA. So to just give those guys opportunities that, like, the potential basketball converts and stuff like that, to say, hey, here's OC, like, he'll work with you. Like, do you want to think about, moving to football? And that's how it starts for a lot of these guys in Africa right now, which is really a big recent change for the IPP compared to recently. So like this, I think the program started like 2017, if I remember right. And basically the way it worked was, every division or a single division every year would basically get like a 3-year practice squad exemption for an international player. He wouldn't count against your 90-man roster count.
Huge. Okay.
He wouldn't count against whatever, at that time it was probably 10 practice squad spots. Mm-hmm. Now it's 16, right? It wouldn't count against that. And, you would have 3 years to develop this guy, and hopefully he would become a contributor for you. There's stuff like Jacob Johnson, I believe is his name, the German fullback who's with the Patriots. There was a guy, I'm spacing on his name, for Washington this past year who in his 3rd year finally got the call up and got into a couple of games. Another one is Jordan Mailata, who
rugby
obviously
player, right?
Yeah, I mean, he was a guy, and again, a lot of this stuff is happening not necessarily like recruiting these guys to play football, but it's like the people in their camp, be it family members, trainers, coaches, whatever, is like, this person isn't a great fit for the sport because, so in the perspective of Kenneth, right, little small to be a power forward for basketball, right? But for Mailata, it was like, this guy's outgrown rugby.
Yeah.
Right. So that's kind of how the NFL was tipped off on him. The process for these guys. So let's use Kenneth for an example. Yeah. Right. How do you find a Kenneth? Right. So like, okay, he converts from soccer to go to a basketball academy because he has the size for basketball. Then they realize, like, okay, you're kind of a bigger dude. Like, this skill set doesn't really fit for basketball necessarily 1-to-1. He does, I think it's called NFL Africa Touchdown, was the camp that OC ran in Ghana, which, by the way, Tennessee just got I think his last name is Okoye. I think it's Emmanuel Okoye, if I recall correctly. Tennessee just got I think like 4 or 5-star recruit pass rusher who was found at that camp in Ghana and then went to the NFL Academy in London, which is basically like an IMG type of academy for international talent. So like that pipeline is already being established, right? So Kenneth goes from the NFL Africa camp, right, to the international combine, which is held in London. And then that's almost like the semifinals, if you want to think about it that way, right? Mm-hmm. And if you do well enough there, and they're doing on-field testing just as like a baseline type of thing. They're introducing them to drills just so that they know what to expect for football moving forward, because a lot of these guys are converts from a different sport, right? Mm-hmm. And then if you advance from that spot, I think last year it was 13 players got into the IPP training program, which is down at IMG, Bradenton, Florida, the massive, high school that recruits. I don't know if they want to say they recruit nationally, but they bring in national and now international talent into the program. I think the strength and conditioning coach down there was a former Alabama guy, so it's not like
Oh, I know a little bit about IMG.
Yeah, they're not. It's not like they're just getting run-of-the-mill high school coaches or something like that to help train these guys. So once these guys come to the States, right? So 13 guys come to the States, it's like a 10-week crash course. And it's everything from like learning the rules of football to like what the line of scrimmage is, because a lot of these guys have never seen a football game until they've come to the States. It's getting them in a real strength and conditioning program for the first time. Yeah. It's getting them into a real dietary program for the first time. And the guy I talked to, Mark Dugarian, who I worked with when we were doing work together for XFL stuff.
Yep.
And now he is the head I think it's like head scout of Europe. They break it down into different sections. Basically, like the NFL is focusing in on South America, Europe, Africa, and what do you call it? the South Pacific. It's basically, New Zealand and Australia, just because that's where you're seeing a lot of these basketball or rugby converts, which is really kind of what they're focusing on, because soccer and baseball body types are a little bit different than what the NFL is looking for. And he was saying, the amount of growth just physically that you see from these guys in those 10 weeks is just insane. So from there, right, that pool of 13 players this year, the NFL expanded it to having 2 divisions bring in guys. 8 of those guys get selected. They get allocated to teams. That is a group effort between consultants who include former general managers, the NFL, IPP program in general, saying like, okay, this guy might be a better fit here for this reason, or this city for that reason, and then the actual request of the teams. So it's a joint effort. It's not like these guys are assigned at random. There is, cuts made the entire way. And they seem, again, pretty excited about the talent that has been untapped in Africa specifically, because rugby, they kind of already have a sport, right? So unless you're getting a guy who has, Jordan Mailata size, it doesn't really make sense for a lot of those guys to convert to football. But, they are open to more Mailatas if they're out there. In Europe,
okay. He's panned out okay.
Yeah. In Europe, it's actually interesting because the recruiting has exploded there, to the point that a lot of these guys who are IPP eligible, which is, 21-year-olds to like 24-year-olds is really what they're looking for, because they're looking at, 3-year developmental time spans. They don't want those guys to be, 30 years old by the time they get into the league. A lot of the guys who are playing in the European leagues at the youth level actually end up, like, the guys who would have been IPP caliber players, right, are now just coming to the States immediately, like, at 18, or they're transferring in during high school and getting a year or two, out here. So like, I was told that like the European pipeline, outside of the pandemic years, because the pandemic years, pandemic changed everything. I don't need to tell you guys that. You guys lived through it. But like, a lot of those guys were planning to come to the States, right, and get some film against American talent. And then the pandemic happened, so they stayed there. And then there was kind of like a talent lag that left them in Europe instead of coming to the States. But once that runs out, they seem to think that the talent from those basketball academies and stuff is kind of what's going to supply the NFL side for these IPP players.
Are we seeing specific positions that are typically the guys that make those final cuts?
1,000%. Mark was telling me, he gets told every single day that, hey, there's a wide receiver that you need to come check out. This guy is so fast. And he's like, okay, he's Tyreek Hill size, but he's not Tyreek Hill speed, right?
It's
like
a different kind of speed.
Yeah, in the NFL, it's I was told, and this was the perspective not from the IPP, but when the IPPs actually assign these players to these teams, right? That it's hard for teams to see the utility in you bringing them a 6-foot wide receiver who runs a 4.5 and has that massive just like experience lag at the position, right? And that's kind of a lot of what they're seeing when they're getting, referrals is kind of how they reference it, referrals for skill players. So really the positions that you're seeing is, I mean, you break down the draft, right? What positions do you see teams highly invest in projects at, right? It's tight ends and it's line of scrimmage guys on both sides of the ball. And really, when you're talking about the size of these guys, it's not really coming at like the interior defensive line, it's coming as the edge rushers. So it's not surprising you're seeing a lot of potential edge rushers, tight ends, and offensive linemen. That's what teams want. That's kind of the bodies that they're getting. It's just kind of like how the sports acts, right? Like there's always going to be demand for those guys. And that's where you see the freak athletes. And that's where you see teams willing to put in all that developmental time for 1 to 3 years to be able to get those guys on the roster.
It's so funny thinking about like how I can get frustrated trying to teach a freshman like what a 5 technique is or what a B gap is or something like that, but then literally having to take a guy and be like, this guy has never played football ever, and explain downs and distances. And
But at the other on the flip side too, you're getting high level athletes
yeah,
who have been competitive in another sport and are coming in with fresh eyes to the point that they've never seen a football game before, that like they haven't established bad habits either.
that's also
right?
very true. Yeah.
So they seem pretty excited about the talent that they've been able to untap. The one thing I will say is they mentioned, or I guess Mark is the guy I talked to. Mark mentioned that, maybe you start to see that change if the IPP gets expanded in some sort of way. I guess there was, so this year, right, they had two divisions, right? I believe it's the NFC North and the AFC West that are assigned IPP players. And now every single team in the NFL has had a shot at an IPP player. So what the IPP looks like moving forward is going to be interesting. Are they going to do, one division, two divisions, four, right? Is it going to be alternating each conference every year? What does that look like? Maybe the positional restrictions change if it expands, right? The other thing is the NFL is pushing hard for flag football to kind of be embraced internationally.
Yep.
They think that the 2028 Olympics, which is in Los Angeles, is going to have flag football as an Olympic sport.
Oh,
So
okay.
there's going to be a pretty significant push for flag football internationally, and maybe that's when you start seeing more wide receivers or defensive backs or something like that come into the league. I was told, quarterbacks is always going to be tough, especially if there's a language barrier with some of these European guys. Nigeria, they speak English, but like if an Italian quarterback, does that guy know English, right? Like that would be a pretty significant barrier. And then running back is another one because it's just so instinctual, and flag football isn't going to really help develop that position either. Maybe that's where you see the rugby guys come in and stuff like that. But
total side note, but if you're seeing all the international pathway program players be like, wow, almost all these guys are from Nigeria, it's because Nigeria is a massive country.
And again, to not undersell what OC is doing there, if you look year by year at the IPP players, for the most part, up until this past season, it has been guys from Europe or the South Pacific. It's been guys who have played football already in Europe or played rugby in the South Pacific. And now the NFL thinks that with the work that OC is doing down there in Nigeria and Ghana, that, there's a legitimate pipeline there that they did not build the infrastructure around until recently, which is why you're seeing this influx of Nigerian talent. I think, what was it? 5 or 6 of the 8 players in the IPP program for this season, or this class, I guess is the best way to say it, are from Nigeria. Yeah.
Yeah. Can you tell us anything specifically about Kenneth? And do you get any measurables? I think you had gotten hopefully anything. I know we've only seen some very rough clips of him at a rookie minicamp, but
yeah, I do have some measurables. So after the IPP program, the 10 weeks, right? They do end up having a pro day. And so they had the pro day this past year at South Florida because it's just so close from IMG and Bradenton to South Florida and Tampa. They don't run on-field drills down there. Like in terms of the time measurables, they do like the positional workout stuff. They don't want those guys putting up numbers just because they haven't had the 4 months of training that like NFL prospects have had coming into this. I can tell you the numbers I got: 6'5" frame, legit 260 and chiseled, 60 or 86-inch wingspan and 36-inch arms. So like we're talking about like, just in terms of the frame, not the weight, right? We're talking about like an NFL left tackle size.
That's
in terms
like
of
Paris Johnson,
reach.
like those super long arms. Yeah.
So, he had rave things to say about Kenneth. Good learner, humble kid, all that stuff. Just a freaky athlete. that's what I got there. There's not really that much. I mean, he hasn't played in the game, right? He hasn't done really time drills outside of, I think, the international combine.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't have those numbers on hand. I think he had a 30-something inch vertical at the international combine. But again, those numbers are before all the training kicks in, right? So that's like off the bus. You know what I mean? That's I wake up, I roll out of bed, I jump I don't know exactly the number, but 34-inch vertical. I mean, after 10 weeks of training that, they're on a diet plan for the first time, strength and conditioning, like I'm sure it would go up. He said that, down there at the international combine, which again is in London and is kind of like the semifinals before coming to the States, you have to overlook almost all technical issues because these guys are just being introduced brand new odd body mechanics that they haven't really practiced when, they're either playing basketball or rugby or whatever.
Yep. Well, makes total sense. Well, it's a crowded edge room. Obviously, a lot can change in 3 years. Any hopes he can make a 90-man roster in 3 years?
Yeah. I mean, well, one, he's on the 91 now. How dare you? But yeah. So, I mean, the Packers have 3 years as long as he passes through waivers to continue to stash him on the practice squad. They do have to do sort of like odd little mechanics if they do ever want to call him up, but that's for the future. Yeah. I think this year he's almost certainly going to end up on the practice squad and just kind of, build up that experience level, right, at the position. It does seem like he's getting looks as an edge rusher. I mean, who knows? I mean, Preston Smith isn't going to be around here forever. So, maybe he ends up becoming the third pass rusher for the team behind Gary and Lucas Van Ness at some point. But they seem pretty optimistic about him and generally like this crop of IPP players in specific.
That's exciting, man. Well, I'll tell you what, as far as a position room on the Packers to be a part of, I think edge is probably the best one you could really ask for him getting experience from vets and sending a guy like Gary.
Preston, Gary who's developed, Lucas Van Ness who can do a little bit of everything. Yeah, I mean, why not?
Yeah, awesome. Well, Justis, thanks so much for coming on, talking about Kenneth. Very excited to see what happens. Hopefully we get a little bit of a taste of him. Is he eligible? That's, I guess, the last question. Is he eligible to play in preseason games?
Yeah, for sure.
Awesome.
He's super eligible to play in preseason games. And, some of these IPP guys who didn't make that cut, who didn't get allocated to the, the eight spots, right? Sometimes those guys do end up making the 90-man rosters and stuff like that just to be able to get some experience. And then they go back into like the 2024 class, for example, and then they can get reallocated from there. I think the Lions have already swapped out their IPP player. If I remember this correctly, it might have been a medical issue. So yeah, I mean, he's for sure going to get on the field at some time. If you're watching Packers fourth quarters, keep an eye on that guy. Cause I mean, as
we know you will be, Justis. We know
Packers fourth quarter storylines go, the kid who was introduced to football in, I think 2021.
Wow.
Has got to be way up there.
Yeah. So. That's exciting. Well, Justis, thanks so much. Anything you got to plug besides the article about the International Pathway Program?
Acme Packing Company. You can find the article there. It's called "How the International Player Pathways Program Scouts Global Talent." I know that's a little bit of a mouthful. If you want to read a little bit more in depth on that, I think I covered a good amount of the information here. And just go on APC, click a couple articles, maybe look at some ads. I don't know.
Unbiased take. APC's great. Awesome. Thanks so much, Justis.
Yeah, man. Take care.